The Thalassic War College on the ocean moon Pelagios had built its reputation on a single, unshakable principle: that true military excellence in aquatic environments could only be achieved by species that had never been unfortunate enough to evolve legs. This wasn't mere institutional bias. The faculty assured themselves during their weekly meetings in chambers filled with pressurized seawater, but simple evolutionary mathematics. Species that had spent millions of years perfecting underwater existence possessed advantages that terrestrial creatures could never hope to match, no matter how many technological prosthetics they strapped to their awkward, air-breathing bodies. The college itself was a marvel of hydroengineering. Suspended in the perpetual darkness of Pelagios's deepest oceanic trenches, where the pressure could compress carbon into diamonds and the cold could freeze thoughts before they fully formed. Its corridors were filled with the sort of liquid atmosphere that made conventional breathing an exercise in controlled drowning, while its training facilities recreated combat conditions that would challenge the fundamental laws of physics if those laws weren't already too intimidated to complain. Director Cascade Tideborn embodied everything the college represented about aquatic military superiority, which was to say she embodied a great deal of self-congratulatory nonsense wrapped in evolutionary credentials that were genuinely impressive if you ignored their complete irrelevance to actual warfare. Her species, the liquid form hydrozoans of the abyssal reach, existed as sentient water that had achieved consciousness through some cosmic accident that biologists were still trying to explain without resorting to phrases like "because the universe has a sense of humor." The college's student body reflected this aquatic supremacy in all its bioluminescent glory. The fluid Morphians could reshape their semi-liquid bodies into any configuration that hydrodynamics might require, making them perfect for infiltration through spaces that would challenge smoke. The pressure-resistant benthics possessed exoskeletons that could withstand crushing depths, while maintaining the sort of graceful mobility that made submarines look clumsy. The bioelectric voltaics generated controlled electromagnetic pulses that could disable enemy systems or fry nervous systems with the casual efficiency of living weapons platforms. Into this temple of aquatic military perfection had wandered Nyx Rivera, human, from the notorious Deathworld Terror, whose admission remained a bureaucratic mystery that had spawned 3 separate conspiracy theories and at least 1 academic paper on the dangers of automated application processing systems. The prevailing explanation among the faculty was that some overworked admissions algorithm had confused extensive maritime experience with actually capable of surviving underwater without immediately dying, which was exactly the sort of clerical error that made interstellar bureaucracy more dangerous than most forms of warfare. NYX's presence at the college was tolerated with the sort of bemused patience typically reserved for experimental subjects or particularly ambitious pets. Her instructors addressed her with a careful enunciation used for species with suspected cognitive limitations, while her fellow cadets treated her with the amused condescension of evolutionarily superior beings watching a primitive creature attempt to use complex tools. The conspiracy against NYX began, as most institutional conspiracies do, with a series of increasingly urgent faculty discussions about the terrestrial problem and its potential impact on the college's reputation for aquatic military excellence. The consensus among her peers was that allowing a land-dwelling biped to embarrass herself during the college's ultimate examination would be professionally irresponsible and potentially damaging to galactic perceptions of aquatic warfare training standards. Flo, a Morphian whose liquid form body could achieve near invisibility when properly motivated, assumed leadership of what they diplomatically termed remediation protocols. Her fluid nature made her ideally suited for equipment infiltration and subtle sabotage, since she could penetrate mechanical systems in ways that left no conventional forensic evidence. Crush, a benthic whose pressure-resistant exoskeleton concealed surprising manual dexterity, contributed technical expertise about life support vulnerabilities and combat system dependencies. Spark, a voltaic whose bioelectrical generation could selectively disable specific components without triggering general alarm systems, provided the electronic warfare capabilities necessary for comprehensive equipment failure. Their elimination plan possessed the sort of elegant simplicity that military theorists claimed to admire but rarely achieved when actual lives were at stake. During the college's legendary deep current trials, NYX's equipment would experience cascading failures that would necessitate emergency evacuation before any permanent damage occurred. Her life support systems would develop critical malfunctions. Her combat gear would lose operational integrity, and her emergency communications would suffer from unfortunate technical difficulties. She would have no choice but to signal for immediate extraction, thus ending her inappropriate military career and returning her to whatever agricultural pursuits awaited her on her primitive homeworld. Nyx herself remained largely oblivious to the full scope of the conspiracy, though she had detected enough whispered conversations and meaningful glances to understand that her continued presence at the college was generating what could charitably be described as mixed reactions among her fellow cadets. She approached these concerns with the sort of philosophical equanimity that her species had developed over millennia of being systematically underestimated by everything from natural disasters to their own technological creations. The morning of the deep current trials arrived with all the ceremonial gravity that military institutions use to disguise the fact that they were essentially elaborate hazing operations with government funding and official recognition. The assembled cadets gathered in the equipment bay, where their individual gear had been meticulously calibrated for the extreme conditions and hostile environment of Pelagios's deepest combat training zones. The trials themselves were designed around simulated warfare scenarios that would challenge even the most aquatically adapted species under conditions that existed at the intersection of physics and sadism. Cadets would descend to depths where pressure could rearrange molecular structures, navigate through underwater canyon systems that had claimed entire battle fleets during historical conflicts, and engage in combat exercises using weapons and tactics that required three-dimensional thinking and the sort of fluid dynamics mastery that most species considered theoretical rather than practical. Director Tideborn delivered the traditional pre-trial address, her liquid form shifting through patterns that her species used to indicate profound seriousness about military topics. The assembled cadets listened with varying degrees of attention, most of them already mentally preparing for challenges that would test the absolute limits of their evolutionary advantages and technological augmentation systems. The descent to the combat zone proceeded according to established protocols, with cadets monitoring their equipment status and adjusting to the increasing pressure as they approached depths that existed in a realm beyond normal biological comprehension. At these depths, water became something approaching a solid medium, pressure waves could shatter chemical bonds, and the darkness possessed the sort of weight and substance that made theoretical physics seem optimistic. The initial phases of the trials unfolded with predictable efficiency that would have impressed military observers if any had been present to witness the spectacle. Flo's liquid form body allowed her to navigate through obstacle courses with a sort of fluid grace that made conventional movement look like mechanical malfunction, while her ability to alter her molecular density made her effectively invisible to most detection systems. Crush's pressure-resistant exoskeleton shrugged off impacts that would have reduced conventional materials to their component atoms, while her multiple appendages manipulated weapons systems with mechanical precision that suggested factory automation rather than biological function. Spark's bioelectrical fields disabled target systems and created electromagnetic interference patterns that would have impressed professional electronic warfare specialists if they had possessed the security clearance necessary to observe classified military exercises. Nyx, meanwhile, moved through the water with what could generously be described as determined awkwardness. She wasn't the fastest, she wasn't the most graceful, and she certainly wasn't the most technologically integrated with her equipment systems. But she completed each required task with methodical persistence that was somehow more unsettling than impressive, as if she were operating according to principles that hadn't been covered in any of the college's theoretical coursework or practical training modules. As the exercise progressed into its most challenging phases, the sabotage began to manifest with clockwork precision that would have been admirable if it hadn't been intended to cause potentially fatal equipment failures. Nyx's life support systems developed their planned malfunctions, creating the distinctive alarm patterns that indicated catastrophic seal failure and atmospheric contamination. Her combat gear began losing operational integrity according to schedule, the advanced materials somehow developing structural weaknesses that should have been impossible under normal operational parameters. Her emergency communications suffered from increasingly severe technical difficulties that left her isolated from command oversight and emergency extraction protocols. The saboteurs monitored their instruments and waited for the inevitable signs of terrestrial panic, the frantic gestures toward surface evacuation, the desperate activation of emergency beacon systems, the admission that Deathworld evolution was simply inadequate for truly challenging aquatic combat environments. Instead, NYX calmly assessed her failing equipment, made what appeared to be a series of calculated tactical decisions, and began systematically discarding every piece of technology that wasn't functioning according to manufacturer specifications. Then she continued with the combat exercise using nothing but the peculiar biological adaptations that evolution had somehow neglected to mention in any of the college's comprehensive xenobiological databases. The observation team, monitoring the trials from their pressurized command facility, watched their instrument displays with growing bewilderment as NYX's biological readings shifted into ranges that should have indicated either catastrophic equipment malfunction or imminent biological failure. Her heart rate dropped to levels that would have suggested cardiac arrest in most documented species, but her oxygen utilization efficiency increased correspondingly. Her core temperature decreased several degrees below what their medical databases considered compatible with consciousness, but her motor functions remained perfectly coordinated and tactically sound. Most impossibly, she was moving faster and with greater combat effectiveness than cadets who still possessed functioning life support and weapon systems. At a depth of 2,000 meters, where the pressure approached the theoretical limits of most organic survival capabilities, NYX encountered Spark struggling with equipment failures that hadn't been part of the original sabotage plan. The Voltaic's bioelectrical generation was creating feedback loops with her own life support systems in ways that the conspirators hadn't anticipated, generating electromagnetic interference that threatened to disable her nervous system along with her technological augmentation. Without hesitation, NYX began troubleshooting Spark's equipment using techniques that weren't covered in any college technical manual or standard operating procedure. She isolated the bioelectrical interference using improvised electromagnetic shielding constructed from salvaged components and mineral formations, then guided the panicking Voltaic through breathing regulation exercises that helped stabilize her electrical output patterns. When Spark's combat systems proved beyond conventional repair, NYX demonstrated manual weapons operation techniques that had been developed by primitive humans during conflicts that had occurred centuries before interstellar warfare became theoretically possible. At 2,500 meters, she found Flow experiencing molecular dissolution, her liquid form body losing structural cohesion under pressures that exceeded her species' natural tolerance despite her advanced equipment and technological augmentation. NYX created an improvised compression stabilization system using salvaged materials and battlefield engineering principles, then showed the terrified Morphean how to maintain molecular integrity through controlled breathing and concentration techniques that appeared to involve a combination of applied biochemistry and what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness. At 3,000 meters, crushed pressure-resistant exoskeleton was developing stress fractures despite her evolutionary advantages and technological protection systems. NYX taught her emergency structural reinforcement techniques, helped her redistribute mechanical loads using principles borrowed from human deep-sea construction methodology, and repaired her combat equipment using tools that she improvised from debris scattered across the abyssal combat zone floor. By the time they reached the deepest phase of the trials at 3,500 meters, NYX had effectively assumed tactical command of the entire exercise, managing equipment failures, conducting rescue operations, and demonstrating combat techniques that made the college's advanced technology look like expensive ceremonial ornaments with delusions of military utility. The simulated enemy engagement unfolded with NYX coordinating tactical responses from cadets who were completely dependent on techniques developed by a species that had supposedly never left its own planetary atmosphere. She demonstrated underwater combat maneuvers that utilized three-dimensional tactical thinking, fluid dynamics mastery, and pressure wave manipulation in ways that exceeded anything in the college's theoretical databases or practical training protocols. Direct-to-Tideborne's liquid form had shifted to patterns that her species typically reserved for religious experiences or complete existential crisis. The observation team found themselves documenting the unprecedented spectacle of a terrestrial biped outperforming the galaxy's most aquatically adapted military specialists using nothing but primitive biological functions and improvised tactical solutions. The ascent from the deepest combat zone required even more sophisticated pressure management than the descent, and NYX guided her charges through decompression procedures that prevented nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness, managed their equipment integration using techniques that bordered on applied miracles, and maintained group morale through what appeared to be a combination of practical instruction, motivational psychology, and aggressive optimism backed by demonstrable tactical Competence. When they finally reached the surface facilities, the assembled faculty and observers were treated to the remarkable sight of a small human female treading water, while supporting 3 technologically superior aliens who were clinging to improvised flotation devices and breathing through emergency apparatus that appeared to have been constructed from spare parts and what looked suspiciously like processed kelp. The investigation into the equipment failures was swift, thorough, and professionally catastrophic for everyone involved except NYX. The conspiracy was unraveled with efficiency that suggested the college's security systems were considerably more sophisticated than their academic evaluation procedures had indicated. The saboteurs found themselves facing disciplinary boards that were less concerned with their attempted elimination of a fellow cadet than with their spectacular failure to understand basic principles of evolutionary biology and species adaptation. The real revelation came during the mandatory post-trial medical examinations, when the college's physicians discovered that humans possessed an integrated suite of aquatic combat adaptations that had somehow escaped the attention of galactic military science for centuries. The mammalian diving reflex could slow metabolic processes and redirect blood circulation to essential organs during extended underwater operations. Enlarged spleen capacity allowed for storage of oxygenated red blood cells that could be deployed during extended combat diving. Enhanced myoglobin concentrations in muscle tissue provided oxygen storage capabilities that exceeded most technological alternatives. Flexible skeletal structures could compress under extreme pressure without permanent damage, while voluntary control over panic responses allowed for rational tactical decision-making in environments that sent most species into evolutionary hysteria. 8 months after the trial debacle, the Thalassic War College had completely restructured its curriculum around combat techniques developed by the only known species that had been foolish enough to evolve complex brains and then wise enough to figure out how to use them for underwater warfare while holding its breath for tactically significant periods. Cadet Nyx Rivera found herself in the unprecedented position of instructing advanced aquatic combat techniques to aliens whose civilizations had never experienced the tactical disadvantage of being separated from their natural aquatic environments. Her courses were oversubscribed by mathematical factors that required specialized computational equipment to calculate, with waiting lists that extended into academic periods that hadn't been officially scheduled yet. Flo struggled with breath-holding exercises that human military personnel mastered during basic underwater demolition training. Crush's evolutionary armor proved surprisingly inadequate for combat techniques that emphasized tactical flexibility and environmental adaptation over raw structural protection. Spark's bioelectrical advantages became tactical liabilities in combat scenarios that required electromagnetic stealth and electrical silence, rather than the dramatic displays of bioelectric power that her species considered militarily sophisticated. Director Tideborn, whose liquid form now shifted to patterns indicating profound philosophical confusion whenever she encountered NYX in the facility corridors, had been forced to revise the college's admission standards to acknowledge that aquatic combat proficiency might be evaluated according to criteria that transcended simple evolutionary adaptation to water environments. The final irony was not lost on the college's military historians, who noted with academic amusement that the galaxy's most advanced aquatic warfare institution had attempted to eliminate a representative of the only species that had ever developed the peculiar combination of intelligence, tactical adaptability, and environmental stubbornness necessary to excel in conditions that would challenge the fundamental assumptions of military science itself. The deep current trials continued as scheduled each academic term, but with modified protocols that assumed all participants might possess hidden evolutionary advantages that could render standard military equipment obsolete without prior warning. The betting pools now favored species with histories of environmental adversity over those that had enjoyed evolutionary comfort, and the college's official motto was quietly changed from depths of excellence to adaptation through adversity. Nyx Rivera graduated with military certifications that require the creation of entirely new categories of tactical achievement, established aquatic warfare doctrines that revolutionized naval combat across multiple galactic sectors, and eventually became the first human to command an interstellar aquatic warfare fleet. Which was ironic considering that space contained approximately 0% water, but apparently required similar skills in three-dimensional tactical thinking and resource management under hostile environmental conditions. Her former classmates, when interviewed for institutional documentation purposes, generally acknowledged that they probably should have paid closer attention during those mandatory xenobiology seminars about environmental adaptation and species survival mechanisms. But then again, hindsight was always clearer than deep water. And even the most evolutionarily sophisticated species occasionally forgot that the most effective military predators were often the ones that looked completely harmless, until someone made the tactical error of trying to eliminate them from their preferred combat environment.